I forgot to ask you, what's the name of your organization?
Alturas Institute. I'm president of the Alturas Institute.
Oh, all tourist or
All
some
tour-
tourist?
Yes, Alturas. In the Latin translation means the higher ground. So we try to promote
Oh, okay.
higher elevated conversations about the
Okay.
Constitution, civic education, and equal protection, and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, folks, it's now 10:30, and it's time for Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. I think this thing is on. Yeah. We just had the 4th of July. It's now the 6th, but the 4th of July wasn't that long ago. And the 4th of July was the birth date of the United States. And it's often, every day, especially with constitutional law and stuff coming up all the time, and various constitutional amendments being discussed, we can often forget or maybe romanticize or not really know what was it like for those founding fathers and what was happening and what were they thinking. We're going to try to discuss that today, and to take a look back so that we can take a look forward, not only where we are now, but where we could possibly go. And my guest today is David Adler, who is the head of the Alturas Institute, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. But I just want you to be thinking about the Constitution and the beginning of America, what its promise was, and what we could get out of it today. Excuse me. So make sure that you read, you have a little note paper, if you would, next to you to jot down some questions, because this is an interactive conversation. And David and I are going to be talking about many different things, but the conversation comes alive when you participate. So we're always looking for your questions, comments, experiences to share in this conversation. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Lawrence. It's great to be with you again. Really looking forward to our conversation and lots of questions. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to get started with our questions, but I want to start off with you telling us a little bit about the Alturas Institute. What do you guys do? And maybe David has been on with us before, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself too. Who are you? Why should we listen to you? And tell us a little bit about the organization.
Good. Thank
and
you.
yourself.
Thank you very much. So the Alturas Institute is a nonprofit 501c3 educational organization created to promote American democracy by advancing public understanding about the Constitution and equal protection of the law and gender equality, and writ large promoting civic education. And so toward this end, it's my good fortune to work with school teachers around the country, helping teachers to better understand the Constitution and how to teach it. And I travel and give lectures, and I write a lot. I write a weekly column on the Constitution, which runs in a number of South Dakota newspapers, supported by the South Dakota Humanities Council, for which I'm very grateful, and in other states as well. And this really reflects, Lawrence, my long career as a constitutional scholar, having taught at various universities and written articles in books, and had the good fortune to lecture nationally and internationally, primarily on the presidential power and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution as a whole. So this is in many ways a labor of love for me to serve as president of the Alturas Institute. because I get paid a little bit to do what I enjoy. And as I used to tell my students, try to figure out what you most want to do in life. And if you can get paid to do it, then you've really won. So I feel very, very fortunate to do this. And here I am talking with you about the Constitution and various matters. So it's a lot of fun for me.
Yeah, I would say you hit the lotto because
Right.
that's a lot of people work in misery all the time, and when you can find something and leave that whatever the thing was making you miserable and do something you enjoy and get paid, that's not a bad deal. So let's
Yeah.
start off, David, with looking at give us a picture of what led up to the 50,000-foot view anyway of what led up to Americans, or at that time English and other people, deciding, hey, we want to go it on our own. This is not working out for us. What brought us to that point? Because that's a major thing, a major turning point for people to make that decision and face the wrath of the English Empire. That's a big deal.
You're certainly right. A very big deal, Lawrence. The reality is that Americans, let us say, beginning in the early 1760s, when we were colonists, were really chafing under the rule of the English Empire, as you pointed out. People began to believe that, in fact, their rights as English subjects were being violated. Their natural rights were being violated. English laws were being passed that colonists and imposed on colonists that the American colonists believed were undercutting their economic and financial opportunities. And they were paying taxes under statutes familiar to many Americans that we learn about at a pretty early age: the Stamp Act, the Hat Act, the Tea Act, the Iron Act, all those kinds of statutes, which caused our eyes to glaze over as young students, but they were real hardship for the American colonists. And so this combination of English imperialism, the denial to the colonists of their rights, and the undercutting of their opportunities, all came together as the 1760s wore on and on into the 1770s. And in those years, a number of American leaders came forth to begin to argue that, in fact, there had to be a better way. And finally, in January of 1776, Thomas Paine wrote what is likely the most famous political pamphlet in American history, called Common Sense. And he made the argument that it's time for America to break from England. It's a matter of common sense. And of course, he spoke eloquently about the many reasons that he believed justified the Declaration of Independence, which was formally announced to the world on July 4th, which, as you said, is our birth date. And what really interests me about all of this is the fact that ideas played such a huge role for the American colonists. Ideas about rights, about representation in government. And one of the great animating ideas that really propelled people here in the colonies to jump on board and to join the movement for independence was, in fact, the rallying cry of the revolution: no taxation without representation. Had powerful appeal then, as it does now, and it resonates in our time. So American thought leaders were reconceiving the world of law and political science, introducing new ideas such as popular sovereignty, and argued, for example, that governments derive their authority from the consent to the governed. That's what makes a just or a legitimate government, that the people have consented. And that, of course, became a cornerstone of the Declaration of Independence. But what stands out more than anything else, and all of our viewers and listeners today will grasp this point, is that America stated to the world that we are creating a new nation conceived in liberty, one which guarantees to all people the principle of equality. That, in fact, the Declaration would say all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is what Abraham Lincoln would say 70 years later constitutes the sheet anchor of the republic. I've always loved that. Lincoln was our poet president, and I think he captured it. The Declaration of Independence is our sheet anchor. It's the founding document. It spurred the cause of revolution and announced to the world, here we are, we're a brand new nation resting on the consent of the governed. It's a really a breathtaking, revolutionary moment, unique for its time in the history of the world.
You know, one of the things that struck me about the revolution is, though, even though we talk about democracy, it wasn't the first time that word came up. And when we go back to the earliest, as far as I guess the American lineage anyway, democracy, it came out of a Greek concept, and correct me if there's somebody who's before that, but I understood it came out of a Greek concept. But both the Greeks and the Romans, their idea of democracy was just for the citizen. All those other people, it wasn't for them, you know. So, and even when we talk about when the English decided that they wanted to spread power and get power from more power from the king, it wasn't really for the serfs. You know, they weren't trying to like spread that power to the serfs. It was just like all the people who had swords, you know, they said, well, hey, you know, like, we help you to stay. We want a few more rights here, you know. So it seems to me, and I'm saying this for discussion. So and I am expecting that you know a lot more about this than I do, and have thought about it a lot more. So I'm looking for education more than domination, so to speak. It seems to me that the Americans kind of took off on this idea and spread it a little bit thinner, but they still came up short in terms of like, it's not really for everybody. We redefined what a man is when we say all men are created equally. Well, yeah, but everybody's not a man, you know, kind of thing. And also it's men, not women, you know. So,
Yeah.
So can you talk about the sort of the gradation and graduation and nuance of that idea of freedom and democracy for everyone?
Yeah, well, you're so right, and it's true, as you point out, that democracy is an evolving concept filled with gradations and nuances. And the reality is, as you noted, the concept of democracy was introduced a long time ago by the Athenians in the 5th century BC in ancient Athens, where the Athenians were the very first to begin to talk about democracy. It's to theorize about it, to talk about what it would mean in practice and what the institutions of democracy were. And so, because it was a first time, it was a first start, the conversation was a little rocky, filled with rough edges, but it certainly wasn't, as you say, a system for all people. It was evolving. Athens, for example, practiced slavery, not racial slavery, but slavery based on military conquest. And it was their view that if their navy, because they had the greatest navy among all the other city-states, could conquer other city-states, they had every right to enslave the soldiers whom they had defeated. And that helped to propel the evolution of the Athenian democracy because now they had workers. They had people who could work the farms, perform other services. In the movies, it's depicted, of course, as fat cat aristocrats lying around the swimming pools and somebody's fanning them with a big fig leaf and so forth. Not maybe that's Hollywood, but the role of slavery was very important. This militaristic slavery, because it allowed people to leave the farms and come participate in direct democracy, and that's the first great step that would set a benchmark for understanding what democracy meant to the English and later during our founding period. And great great philosophers, particularly Aristotle, who was the champion of democracy, said that in a democracy, the poor necessarily rule, by which he meant the many, because most people were poor. And when he would ask when people would ask him, what should the policies be? His response was beautiful. He said, well, what do the people want? What a concept. What do the people want? So we could talk about this for days and days, but that did set for the founders of our nation the benchmark of a democracy. So when the colonists declared revolution, launched the successful revolution, and then began to write state constitutions and ultimately the national constitution, our founding fathers were working against a backdrop of direct democracy. And it's why James Madison would say in 1787, defending the Constitution, we can't have a democracy here because we're too large, because they were conceiving of a direct democracy as practiced in Athens, where everybody could come together in a common site and setting and discuss and debate issues. That's why Madison said, we're going to settle for a Republican democracy, a republic, a kind of a hybrid where we're going to elect people to reflect our views, wield our wills, and so forth. And so the democratic republic that the founders established, which was for sure the most democratic of any nation at that time in the history of the world, nevertheless drew very crude and ignorant distinctions. As you pointed out, women were not considered citizens. Women weren't going to enjoy the rights that white men or some white men would enjoy. Obviously, there was no place for African Americans who were under enslavement, and American Indians were horribly treated. So those are the gradations and the nuances that you are referring to. But nevertheless, it was a good start. We made a good start, Ralph Waldo Emerson said. And then we began to evolve. But I think, Lawrence, the ideas that the framers were grappling with and promoted would serve the country well. And I should just say, and to finish this long monologue on this point, it was Lincoln, I think, who very nicely pointed out that, of course, when the founders wrote the Declaration of Independence and Jefferson said all men are created equal, Lincoln said they knew in their minds that they did not mean in practice that all men were created equal because of the mistreatment of so many. But their sense was one of aspirations. When they talked about these rights for all, they were speaking aspirationally, as Lincoln said, at a time when the country would reach a certain degree of political and social maturity, where the principle of equality for all could become a practicing point of law.
Right. One of the things that I find interesting when I look back to those times is that even though the founding fathers were, let's say they were less than imaginative on this point, there were people who were more imaginative. They didn't gain the day. And one of them actually was one of the founding fathers, and that was Thomas Paine. And one of the interesting things that I find is that when people are quoting all kinds of things from Madison and all of those, and as you pointed out, it was Paine really who set the course for the ordinary person to buy into this new concept. He was the one that sold the idea and basically saved Washington's little behind, because it was like getting those people to rally, to help Washington when he was about to lose. So how did he get diminished? How is it that he's not up there when people talk about the founding of the United States and what the founding fathers were thinking? Why aren't we talking about Thomas Paine?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So you're absolutely right that Thomas Paine was a leader among leaders in promoting the very concept of revolution. And to the many fence sitters in the American colonies, and there were many, because Americans considered that they weren't even Americans. The colonists considered themselves Englishmen. They were loyal to the crown. It was hard to conceive of breaking from the mother country. So it took powerful ideas to pull those people into the circle of colonists who were willing to break from England. And it was Paine's powerful argument. So he becomes the leader of the leader. He had great relationships with other intellectuals of his time, Samuel Adams and John Adams, and of course, Thomas Jefferson. He had a correspondence with Jefferson. And so he becomes a leader. But here's what's really interesting. I'm glad you raised that. He is a leader among the leaders. But after the revolution, he has almost no utility to the country as it begins the process of creating the republic. His ideas were animating, but he didn't play a public role because he was arguing against the monarchy. No reason why people should be subjugated to a monarch. He had achieved his high purpose, and he would go on, of course, to write influential letters and pamphlets. But at that point, I think Thomas Paine, who was in reality a real revolutionary, had achieved his goal, and now he moves to France, and he's going to aid the French Revolution. So here was a man who was filled with conviction, thought everybody enjoyed what today we would promote as human rights. Nobody should be denied these natural rights. And so he went to France, aided the revolution, came back, and then, so he was not here for the Constitutional Convention, which would have given him a very prominent role. And indeed, what if his voice were heard in Philadelphia, arguing for human rights? One can only imagine that his powerful arguments against slavery, for example, would have been very influential. Who's to say? But he would have been there on the floor in the making those arguments. So he's not here for the convention, which at that point, for most of the great leaders that we remember, are the men who wrote the Constitution. I'll come back to this in just a second. But if you're not there in the Constitutional Convention, how are you going to achieve the great fame as a framer of the Constitution, as opposed to one of the great founding fathers, a broader concept that would include Thomas Paine or James Otis and others, or Sam Adams, who wasn't there? But then he comes back and he is beloved. And Washington never forgot just how important Thomas Paine was. And so Thomas Paine was a pauper. He was in debtor prison for a while in the 1790s. Washington got a group of people together to buy him a farmhouse in upstate New York, where he lived out the rest of his life. So it was a way of paying tribute to this great revolutionary. But I think it's interesting and a point to ponder more, how one achieved great fame during that period. And it really was to either be in the Constitutional Convention or to be participating at the margins, because of course Jefferson and John Adams weren't in the Constitutional Convention, and they achieved great fame in other ways through elective office as presidents a little bit later.
Yeah. Well, I want to open it up right now to the rest of our esteemed panel here. Do you all have any questions, comments, observations about the beginning, the founding, the birth of America? Any contributions to the conversation? Going once, going twice. Maybe Vicky has something.
I have a question, but it doesn't go back to the beginning. When somebody is pulled over by the police and they say, I don't have to answer you, and they call it a sovereign citizen, and they whip out some books from the back seat, what does that refer to, the sovereign citizen? You know what I'm talking about?
I do. That's a great question. That is the concept of a sovereign citizen is part of a movement by people who are essentially denying the authority of government at different levels, whether it's local, state, or national. And so they want to assert more power for individuals, less power for the state. Nothing wrong, certainly, with the assertion of individual rights and invoking the Bill of Rights and state rights whenever they're applicable. But the concept of resisting governmental authority here in this country represents as, something of a real concern because through the social contract, which was essentially the drafting of the Constitution, we agree to abide by the laws and to adhere to institutional authority. Now, I just said a lot, and I swept too broadly. I'm not saying that we don't have the right to challenge governmental authority. We certainly do, in a civil way, not in a violent way. And we should always assert, for example, our First Amendment rights to critique and criticize governmental actions and policies and laws. But those who are in the sovereign resistance want to take their ideas a little bit further than what we would ordinarily understand under the terms of the social contract, which is to say, as I pointed out, we have rights and we agree to abide by the laws. We can resist the laws, certainly through nonviolent civil disobedience, as practiced in other countries, for example, by Gandhi, or here in our nation by Martin Luther King. And that would mean that you would sit down to point out what you would consider to be the immorality of a law, and then you would wait to be arrested, because the key point is you think the law is so immoral, you're not going to abide by it, you're going to peacefully disobey it, and then you're going to wait to be arrested, and the hope is that you would draw the attention of the nation to the immorality of the law. And of course, this was the driving force behind the great civil rights revolution in America. So you've raised a nice issue. Thank you.
Well, I want to get back to kind of the fundamentals of something Vicky was, I think, getting at, or if it wasn't her intent, at least it stirred it in my mind, is getting to the whole point of government. And then we have one question in the chat. Well, if we can, I think it'll lead into that question, but let's deal with the fundamentals. Why do human beings need government, or do they need government? What's the point of having a government at all?
I like that question a lot, Lawrence. Well, consider our own Declaration of Independence. After stating that people are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, then the Declaration says, in order to secure these rights, government is created. So government is a device. It's an organizing feature. It's an organizing tool that helps to pass laws and policies that would reflect the interests, the needs of the people, the wishes of the people. And we need it to promote safety, which was one of the founders' first concerns. If you look at the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, for example, it states those major purposes of government, including to maintain liberty and promote the general welfare, to provide for the common defense. So the creation of government, if turn back the clock many centuries ago to some of the great philosophers who discussed this, whether it's John Locke, who was influential on the founders, or Thomas Hobbes, among others. They said that government is created in order to protect the people. Under the social contract theory, which was articulated by John Locke and embraced by our founders, life is good in the state of nature where there is no government, and life is good. But then things begin to go sour. The mentally quick begin to exploit the mentally dull. the physically strong begin to exploit the weaker people. And people realize that we're going to need to organize ourselves, create some governmental institutions to promote our general welfare and to protect our rights. And this is that step then where we create the social contract. We, the people, create government, and we limit what government can do. That's our right as sovereigns. We're creating a government to serve our needs. And so when the social contract then is drafted, in theory, it creates government and limits government. And this is the way that we will proceed to provide safety, carry out rules and regulations that will serve the general populace and maintain rights. The founders were, of course, part of a generation that were committed to less rather than more government. And people such as Thomas Paine, for example, would say, government is a necessary evil. We don't want any more government than we need. And of course, that's been the staple for many throughout American history. But it's also true that Jefferson adhered to that Paine view, as did other founders. So the great question always, Lawrence, is how much government do we need? And that's what divides Americans. And what kind of a government should we have?
Right. Well, my observation is that this particular point is almost never discussed. And to me, it's the baseline. If you don't understand, well, what are we talking about? What are the good parts? You can talk about, like, well, the government is somebody stopping me and giving me a ticket, or coming over and keeping me from firing my firecrackers or something like that. But if we think of human beings as as social animals, and our competitive advantage in nature is the ability to work together. Things like language greatly facilitating that. If you look at that, you would think, okay, well, human beings have some very good advantages in working together. And if you don't have any government, how do you all dance together? How do you all, sing together? Who sets the drum for different things? You don't have to have necessarily one person who makes all the decisions. But even if it's like your rotating thing, if you get together to have a potluck dinner, somebody has to say, well, would you do the potatoes and I'll do the vegetables, or something like that? Who's going to finally be responsible for picking a place? All of those things, you find a way, and that collective effort, to me, is government. However you put it together, it doesn't have to be an overarching thing, but some way there has to be an organism, even if it's like the bees, where the queen is there, she makes little baby bees, but she doesn't really control. There's a synergy that happens. I think human beings are a little bit more complex, so we may not be able to do that. But to me, there's always has to be some kind of way that we communicate and work together. End of my monologue.
Well, I agree with you completely. And of course, this takes us all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, who talked about these kinds of great issues, including what kind of a system of government to create. And of course, the Athenians and the Romans favored some sort of democratic republic, and they made arguments for that. And then over the course of the centuries, the great question would be, how much government do we need? How much is too much? And then what should be the nature of our government? A democracy, an aristocracy, a monarchy? What form should it take? And those arguments, Lawrence, are still in many ways at the core of our disagreements in this country right now. Many people fear that our democracy is being threatened, that rights are under attack, that the institutions of government are under attack, and how do we defend democracy? Others seem less interested in democracy or its cardinal principles, such as equality for all. So these discussions revolve across the centuries.
We have one question is, Can you describe the difference between common law and maritime law, and which law is the U.S. under? I'm not sure if I understand that question, but you might.
Sure. Well, common law, of course, is very old, going all the way back to England in the 14th century, when judges began to decide cases and their cases made law. That was the origin of common law. And then the beauty of common law was that people began to copy some of these judicial decisions. We didn't have Xerox machines, or I've just dated myself, haven't I? Using that. Well, you know, everything's a Coke. Everything's a
Yeah,
soda.
yeah. All right.
So,
Or pop.
yeah, pop. It's pop. Without mimeograph machines and copying machines. So monks and others began to record these judicial decisions and then located these decisions in different places around England so that these decisions would become precedents, and lawyers, called pleaders in their day, could consult what judges said about certain factual situations so they could advise their clients. And so suddenly the English legal system begins to mature, it begins to grow, and it creates a national conversation about what the law means, how judges would interpret laws passed by Parliament. Well, here's what Judge Smith said down in Southampton, and here is what Judge North said up in London, and so forth. So it was really the very practice of copying decisions that created the system of precedent. That's the backbone of the English legal system, which we inherited during our period as colonies. And then after we successfully, after we won the revolution, then we were in the driver's seat to decide which parts of English law we would keep. We could discard some, we could create some. And our own system then began to follow this same idea of judge-made law or common law. It's the backbone of our system. And of course, judges hand down decisions based on laws passed by states or at the federal level by Congress. Maritime law, of course, refers to the law of the high seas and the oceans and so forth. And this was very important to us at the time of our founding because we relied on international trade, and so it was important to understand the law of the high seas and what international law said about sales of goods and maritime rights, the rights of countries to certain amount of distance off the shore of each nation. That would refer to our sovereign body of water. So that's a different area of the law, somewhat complicated, but still important.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's not an either or both and. We operate on both systems, but for different reasons, and they have different functions. They're not the same.
That's exactly right. So you're right. It's an and. So we have many different kinds of law. We have maritime law, we have commercial law, we have administrative law, we have constitutional law. So we're a country of laws.
Okay. So another question from the chat group. And by the way, if you don't feel like you're too shy to talk, then maybe you could put your question if you have them in the chat, and we'll try to get to those. Another question is, do you feel we are in danger at all of losing our democracy?
What a fine, important question to ask. As you know, people all over the country are writing about this, discussing it. I think so. First of all, we would say, do we have a right to expect that our democracy will last forever? We certainly don't. And our founding fathers, in fact, were very concerned about the future of the country. They had many doubts about the longevity of the republic. We can look back 250 years and say, oh, we've been through a lot of struggles, but you might have been a little more confident in the future of the country. But they had a right to doubt it because they feared, among other things, the rise of an executive tyrant. They could fear the passage of despotic laws that would deprive people of their rights. They could fear the rise of a class of people who could dominate government who would not have any interest in the common folk. They had lots of reasons, and they looked to history to inform them about those fears. And everywhere they looked, they saw that democracies or republics didn't last very long. So they were rightly fearful. And of course, historically in this country, we've gone through some very rough times, whether it's the Civil War or the Depression or McCarthyism. And I would add now this period now in which I very much believe that our democracy is being severely challenged because of the attacks on our institutions, the behavior of people who serve in these institutions, the rhetoric out there on the campaign trail, which is very much attacking democracy and the rights of the people, and frankly, the disregard of democratic principles and values, including those embodied in the Declaration of Independence, as well as in our Bill of Rights. And then, in addition to all that, and I would just stop at this point, the lack of civic education, the fact that so many Americans don't have quite an adequate understanding about our constitutional system, how powers are allocated among the three branches of government, what rights and liberties we have. And if we lack that basic understanding, we find it very difficult to hold government accountable. Hard to hold governmental officials accountable if we don't quite understand what the scope of the authority of that branch is, or how or when governmental actors have leaped beyond their bounds of authority. That's why civic education is so important, and why it's important to the Alturas Institute, and always has been to me, because governmental accountability was the key feature of our Constitution in 1787. James Madison said as much. And the great question he posed was how to hold government accountable. It was the great question then. It's the great question now. And that requires some knowledge among the citizenry. So those are all problems why I'm concerned about the future of our democracy.
Well, let's talk about, if you don't mind, the difference in views, because we've talked about different actors on the stage of developing this new nation and a constitution under which it's going to operate. We know that there were debates, and very strong debates. Yeah. Can you give us kind of the 50,000-foot view of what interests there were and what role they played in what finally became our Constitution, at least as a starting point?
Well, that's certainly true. At the Constitutional Convention, there were many ideas, different values that were being promoted by the delegates who were sent to Philadelphia to help draft this Constitution. And your point is certainly demonstrably true. They were debates. And think about this, the primary source of our knowledge about what occurred in the Constitutional Convention was the handiwork of James Madison's notes, which he published under the title, The Debates of the Constitutional Convention. So that implies, as you point out, that there were different viewpoints. So at the 50,000-foot level, we would say there were different sectional and regional interests, right? There obviously, those states that were the primary slave-owning states wanted to maintain slavery. Other actors, other delegates from northern states who were interested in abolishing slavery clashed with their southern delegates. And of course, that meant that there were going to be huge fights. There was the possibility of abolishing slavery. Some wanted to do it. Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and others were at the forefront of doing that. But the Southerners made it clear that if the Northern delegates intended to abolish slavery, they were going to leave the convention. They would walk out. And of course, that's the great dilemma that the framers faced, to try to find the votes to abolish slavery, but risk losing the South, half the country roughly, and that wouldn't work. And that's why the framers made the great decision, a very difficult, terrible decision, to continue slavery so that they could have a nation where people could find agreement on other points. That's one area. Another interesting point of contention that is really interesting is how to structure the treaty-making power, because the treaty-making power, which eventually becomes a shared power between the president and the Senate, would affect our entire foreign policy. The framers thought that would be the essence of our foreign policy, but the treaty-making power would be the principal way for the nation to conduct its economic business with other nations abroad. There was concern among the Southerners that a Congress dominated by Northern delegates would sell out the interest of the South to serve the interests of the North. So there were financial and economic differences. There were great questions on the point of, if we create a presidency, should it be a single person or a plural presidency, 3 people? What would be the relationship between the president and Congress? Should we create a judiciary? And should that include a Supreme Court? And should the federal judiciary have the power of judicial review? And what would that portend? We could go on, but one of the other issues was the division over whether or not our Constitution should include a Bill of Rights. Inside Philadelphia, at the end, when the proposal was introduced, a couple of leading framers said, well, we don't need a Bill of Rights because the Constitution is one of limited powers. It's understood that if a branch of government, let us say Congress, doesn't have authority to regulate speech or religion, for example, then Congress can't touch those subjects. So we don't need a Bill of Rights that would fence off free speech or freedom of religion. And that incited a quarrel. Say, wait, you're asking us to trust the government that we're trying to limit? Not sure that's a winning argument. So they adjourned without a Bill of Rights. But at the end, James Madison and a few others said, look, if this proposed Constitution is ratified and I am elected to the first Congress, I promise to introduce a Bill of Rights, which he did on June 9, 1789. So many debates and important compromises. And here was a great compromise. Madison said, if I'm elected, I will agree. And with that promise to introduce a Bill of Rights, many states agreed that they would, the people in the states, I should say, agreed that they would ratify the proposed Constitution. So debates and compromises fueled the Constitutional Convention.
So it just seems to me that the amount of turmoil and dare I use the word consternation, but the kind of upheaval and conflict of ideas can be easily, let's say, underappreciated, like how difficult it was. I mean, like if you take like the South, if they didn't have slaves, who was going to do that work? And how are they're going to lose what was a majority of their personal wealths, right? Those people were not ready to let that go. And they were needed to make what somebody decided was going to be the United States. So it just seems like there are a lot of arguments that we don't appreciate how difficult those arguments were to people, especially if you throw the whole thing of white supremacy in the mix. And you have people who, if they get up in the morning and they didn't think that they were better than other people just because of the color of their skin, they wouldn't have any reason to get up. It's like it was so much a part of their sense of who they were that, it's kind of hard. I mean, I'm not making excuses for them, but I'm just saying, well, yeah, they got a problem. It's like, and so they would have a problem with a constitution that didn't allow them to keep mistreating people. So, and that's to put it nicely. So how does America, you know, we have about 10 minutes left. How does America deal with that based on where we are now? What can we do to fulfill the assumed aspirations of those people who didn't make it perfect, but they did what they could? We're looking forward now. What do you think is our path forward to attaining the aspirations of the founding fathers, assuming that it was for life, liberty, and justice for all?
Mhm. Right. That's a great question. I love it. The first thing to note, of course, as you pointed out, is that not everybody came to Philadelphia with the same views, the same values. Quarrels were evident from the start. There were tense times when various delegates threatened to leave, Southerners threatened to leave, and that would have exploded the convention. Some Northern delegates, Alexander Hamilton, for example, was frustrated. He would come, give a speech, leave, come back, give a speech. So he flitted in and out. So it was a very, very tense time, and everything was on the line. The fate of the nation. Would there be a nation? Because after all, at this point, America had been going through a very, very deep recession. In fact, there was a depression, and there were concerns that if the governing document, the governing constitution at that time, the Articles of Confederation, was not replaced, then the nation, after a decade, just a decade late after the revolution, would completely fail. There were national security threats. Other nations, England was eyeing parts of the United States. France was. There were concerns about Spanish interests in Florida and elsewhere. National security was a major concern. We were struggling with a depression. States weren't getting along. They were supposed to get along under the Articles of Confederation, but commercial knife play dominated. So they weren't friendly to one another, exploiting, taking advantage. America was a mess. And so the proposed Constitution that was being written across the summer of 1787 was seen as a way of saving the nation, but it was going to be imperfect. And in fact, it was Ben Franklin who at the end of the convention said, we've done the best we can. Now, through the amendatory clause, we leave to future generations of Americans to improve upon our work. We've done that. We've only amended the Constitution 27 times, of course. That's always an option for us. But the broader questions that we have to address here in this nation are the broader social and political problems that seem to defy the scope of institutional possibility now, which is a sad thing. It wasn't that long ago that most Americans trusted our three institutions of government. And while we would all quarrel and quibble about the policies and actions, we nevertheless still felt that there's a democratic core, that is a core of people committed to our democracy, and we're going to hash out the policies and so forth. And we might find a way to compromise, and we'll come back to fight another day. That seems so lost now, in particular in Congress. As the American people well know, Congress is deeply divided, polarized. How can we get significant things done? And we have grave problems confronting our nation, and we don't see a sense of accomplishment on many, many issues. And
Did we lose David? Can you hear him, Colby? Can you hear David?
Can't see him either. Looks like we lost him.
Oh, that's too bad. I can see him, but he's frozen. Oh, there he goes. He's connecting again. There he goes. He's connecting to the audio.
I'm here. Are we reconnected now?
No, okay, yeah, we're reconnected now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
So, and
okay.
I can't see you on my screen, Lawrence, but so
I'm
we're
here.
back. Okay, we're back together. So I think
Okay.
I was saying that the threats to American democracy reflect in part a loss of confidence in the institutions of government, owing to the great polarization and the deep division in our country. The Supreme Court in recent decisions now is rendering opinions that seem not to reflect constitutional principles or the behavior of the chief law court in our country. It's aggrandizing power at the expense of Congress, substituting its own policy views for those of the executive and congressional branches. The level of rhetoric, the harsh rhetoric in our country is beyond the pale, where it seems the more severe somebody can condemn the other side, the more attention they gain. So going forward, it requires, I think, number one, a reassertion in our country of the importance of civic education, so that even though we're going to have different values, we can all as a nation sit around the same big table, so to speak, with an understanding of what the Constitution means and the importance of democratic values and principles, and that our nation should adhere to constitutional principles and democratic values, thus implying, obviously, that the democracy is worth saving. That's one thing. Secondly, in my own view, the time has come for some very important reforms with respect to the judiciary. I think the obvious politicization of the appointment process now tells us that we should have term limits for Supreme Court justices, not in effect a lifetime job assumed as long as they behave well, because it's possible to control the court ideologically for decades and decades, and we've seen the abuse of power. So I'm in favor of the imposition of term limits as well. We need also, I think, to remember that members of Congress are there to serve the people, and this goes all the way back to the founding of our nation, and that, in fact, I have reached the point I'm in favor of term limits for members of Congress, a point that I slowly evolved to. And while you and I and everybody would have our favorite members of Congress, I don't find anybody to be indispensable, and the very prospect of serving so long has a corruptive impact in terms of campaign finance and so forth. So those are, please.
I was just going to comment that I have also evolved on that issue, but my evolvement has to do with let's term limit lobbyists first, and then
Yes.
after that we could because if they're there permanently, and we have newbies and fresh meat coming in they're just going to eat those guys up alive. So you got to have that first.
Yes, you're certainly right. I agree with you. And in my dream package of reforms, I would include publicly financed campaigns, because money corrupts. There you go. You heard it here first. Money corrupts. I wish I could have been the person who first said that. So I would do that. I would hope for a passage of laws to impose campaign finance laws, term limits. Here, I would also say that, in fact, we should have support for members of Congress for housing when they go back to Washington. And here's why. I don't want simply the people who are wealthy enough that they can afford to own two places, one at home and one in Washington. We can get a better mix of people if, in fact, we have public housing. And so there can be a subsidy for members of Congress. That would do another thing. It would encourage members to bring their families with them, which used to happen in Washington. And that had a very great value, because then Republicans and Democrats would socialize. They would become friends. Their kids would go to the same schools, belong to the same organizations. Very hard to demonize people with whom you are regularly interacting. That all seemed to end in the mid-90s. So I would like that. And with term limits, nobody's going to give up their career or sacrifice their financial futures. That's very important. And I know we're about out of time, so I would just say that it's important at the Supreme Court level to have these reforms that I mentioned, and hope that the court would restrain itself, not engage in the kind of activism now that has been exhibited over the last couple of years, knocking down precedents, overturning precedents have been 50 to 75 years old, and it would return to being a court of law and far less a political court.
Thank you so much. It's unfortunate that we're out of time because, as you mentioned at the top of this, we could go on, but we'll hopefully have you back again, and we can continue with some of the numerous things that we have to talk about. Want to thank everyone else for joining us today, and tune in next week, same time, same station, where we'll party on. Goodbye.
Thank you, Lawrence. I enjoyed being with you. Thank you very much.